Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at another short Latin story. Now this one is called Socrates, and it comes from Easy Latin Stories for Beginners by George L. Bennett. Now you've heard me say this before with all the videos that come from Bennett. What Bennett is calling Easy Latin Stories for Beginners are not necessarily easy, and I wouldn't necessarily say they're for beginners. I think it just has to do with the timing. I'm sure in 1879 this is something that a beginner Latin student probably could have picked up and read pretty easily. On my end, what I would always tell you when you read this, I think they're best suited for that more sort of intermediate range. Maybe if you're in Latin 2 or 3 and you've studied a little bit of Latin so far, I would say, at least on my end, with my Latin 1 students, I would not be able to give them this story. I just don't think they'd be able to unpack a lot of the grammar and how Bennett writes. But that being said, I think these are a great way for anyone trying to learn Latin to break away from a traditional textbook or curriculum and just read something different. So Bennett does a really good job of picking stories that have to either come from history or maybe it's like a fable or something, a myth, just something that is different, I would say, than what you would normally see. So they're a great way to challenge yourself and test yourself a little bit. But again, I'd probably peg it at that maybe Latin 2 or Latin 3 range, depending. Okay. So in this particular video, we're going to see or read about Socrates, the famous Athenian philosopher of the 5th century BC. So he's often credited as being the founder of Western philosophy, right? So in this video, we're going to unpack some of the thoughts, or his thoughts, meaning Socrates' thoughts on death. And I'm assuming that Bennett probably adapted these from different stories that come about from Socrates' trial and death. I've always told you whenever we do philosophy, I am not the biggest philosophy person. So if you're interested in ancient Athenian philosophy, I'd highly recommend that you do some research on your own, look into Socrates. Even me, the very, very amateur, not such a big philosophy person, I've read about Socrates and I find that part, like his general story, interesting. So he's a good one. If you're going to go anywhere for philosophy, you should probably at least know who Socrates is. So I'd recommend that you do some work on your own, right? There's a lot of great resources out there. Take some time, look into it, and have some fun, right? Particularly if you do like philosophy, okay? Now, as we go through this video, what I'm going to do at first is read the story to you in Latin, just so you can work on hearing it, right? If you don't have anyone to read it to you. Like I always tell you, my pronunciation is nothing fantastic, but at the very least, this way, if you're by yourself and have no one to read it to, you can at least hear it one time. If you are a Latin student in a class, though, and you have a classmate you can read with, the best thing you can do is to read this aloud, right? Bring it to life, work on your speaking, your pronunciation, and if you have that partner, they can read it back to you so you can work on your listening skills. You never want to just read Latin by yourself in your head without speaking it. One, you're shutting off parts of your brain that will help you understand it. And two, it's a little boring, right? It is a language. You want to actually bring it to life. The other thing I'd suggest you do is do a pre-read, right? If you're reading through this, maybe just pre-read it, pick out any vocab you don't know, look it up, make a little Quizlet or something in practice. It's really hard to know what's going on if you don't know what the words mean. So I'd always kind of start there. And the other thing is, if you're reading it and you really want to get a really good translation and work on those skills, I'd recommend the read and reread method. You've heard me say this a lot before. Read through the entire story, write down any problem areas you have. When you're done with your first read, try to look them up, right? Try to see where you're going wrong. If it's vocab, that's kind of easy. If it's grammar, it might be a little bit more tricky, but try to figure out where you're going wrong and then repeat that process over and over again. I always recommend this to my students. I think it's the best way to really learn the Latin and practice it, because by the time you're done with the second, third, or fourth read through, whatever it is, you should be able to read this story from start to finish without too much trouble, and that's how you know you've really got it. Okay? So all that being said, let's dive in. I'll read the story too, then I'll pause it and we'll go through it together. Okay? So here's the story, and it goes like this. You have in eundem carcarem paucis post annis Socrates iet, eodem scelere judicum. Qui est igitur eius sermo apud judices? Lubenter inquit, morti obviam ibo, alterum enem de duobis fiet, aut sensus omnino omnes mors auferet, aut in alium quendam ex his locis abibimus. Itaque aut somno fruemur, aut cum optimo quoque cive loqui poterimus et versari. Okay, so let's pause it right there for a second. Again, my pronunciation is, I always joke, a lot of you tell me, it's nothing fantastic, but that's all right. If you need just someone to read it to and you want to listen to it again, pause video, go back, listen to it a few times, whatever you need. But again, if you're with a classmate or a partner, that's the best way to do it. Have them read it to you, right? You'll be even better off. But one way or another, if you haven't done what we spoke about in the beginning of the video, pause, go back and do it. Otherwise, we're going to move forward and unpack this just a line at a time, okay? So this is picking up a story about Socrates, okay? And you have in the same prison, right? Eundem karkarem. A karkarem is a prison. After a few years, or paukis postanis, you could even say a few years later, Socrates went, right? Socrates iet. So it's picking up a story. I'm not sure exactly where Bennett is picking up in the story, but again, he's kind of like in the middle of things, you might say. But he's saying a few years later, Socrates went to the same prison for the same crime, right? So you have eodem scelere, right? For the same crime of his judges, Eudicum, right? So in other words, it's saying Socrates has been thrown in prison again, right, by his judges. Okay, so he's sitting in prison. Then you have qui est igitur, right? So what, therefore, is his speech? Eos sermo, right? Think like sermon, his speech. Apud judices means like before the judges, right? Among the judges means he's talking to them. So it's asking sort of a rhetorical question. What is he going to say to these judges who have thrown him in prison? Okay, now we get a quote from Socrates. And again, Bennett is adapting some ancient Greek here, but it's a good view of Socrates' trial. Okay, so he says, "Lubenter, willingly," he says, right? Morti obiam ibo, I will go to meet. So the obiam literally means something like against, but I think to meet is probably an easier way to translate in English. Again, you might disagree in the comments, but that's how I would do it. So he said, willingly, he said, I will go to meet death, morti, right? So he says, I'll gladly go to my death. Then you get the next line where he continues and he says, Alterum enim de duobus fiat. So he says, for, right, I'll gladly go to meet my death. For one of two things will happen, fiat, right? So alterum de duobus, right? One of the two paths is going to be true, right? And then he has the out, so either or. So he says, aut sensus omnino omnes mors afferet. Right, so he says either death, right, mors, auferet, will take away all senses, sensus omnes, omnino, altogether. So he says either death will take away all my senses, or, right, in aliam quendam ex his locis abibamus, he says, or we will go, or we shall go, abibamus, right, we shall go to some other place from these places. So in aliam quendam, he says, we'll go to some other place from these places, meaning like from this earth. So what he's saying is either I'm going to be dead and death will take away all senses and I'm not going to care, right? And then it's like, that's fine. We don't have any sensation. Or we're going to go somewhere else that's better than where we are here, right? So he's saying either way, I'm happy to go to death. And I think this is kind of a viewpoint that a lot of people do have about death. Not that people aren't afraid of it, but some people take that mentality of like, either I'm not going to care and I won't feel anything, or I'll be somewhere better than where I am right now, right? So that's basically what he's saying with these two paths that he's going to take. So that's why he says, I'll face it either way. Okay, and then he's going to go into that that a little bit more when he says itaque aut somno fruemur aut cum optimo quoque kiwe loqui poterimus et versari. So he says, and so, or therefore, you might say itaque. He says either, again, another out, right, of these two paths. He says either we will enjoy sleep, somno fruemur, right? So he says either I'm going to be happy, right? And he's doing like a rhetorical we, right? He says either it's fine and we're going to sleep because we have no senses, or we will be able, right? Poterimus, he says we will be able to, loqui, to converse, to speak, and to dwell, versari loqui, right? To speak and to kind of dwell with all the best citizens, cum optimo kiwe. Okay, so he's saying I'm fine either way because option A, there's no senses, I'm dead and I can't feel anything, so I'll enjoy the sleep, right? Take a good nap. Or if we do go somewhere else and there's some other better thing waiting, I'll be able to have a great conversation with all these people, right? All these best citizens. Okay, so again, it's a fun little story, a short one. It's just giving you a sort of a philosophical perspective. So take it for what it is, and it might get you thinking or do a little more research and dive into a little bit more about ancient Greek philosophy on your own. That would be great. But one way or another, if you have any questions at all, feel free to put them in the comments below. I'm always happy to help you out. I'll answer any questions you might have. Otherwise, read through it until you're able to do it pretty well on your own without too much trouble. That's how you've understood the Latin and you're in a good spot. And again, I keep saying it, but go do some research on your own, right? Look up Socrates, look up his trial, his death. There's some really great stuff there. Good luck.